lies will be exposed.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Hard Lens Media. We have our second guest of the day joining us here. She has been one of the dauntless few in regards to calling out the neoliberal establishment. We had the privilege of interviewing her not only live on air, but also face-to-face on the ground, especially when she was here at the DNC convention in Chicago. There was an event that was hosted with not only the Green Party, but Dr. Jill Stein, many other community and activist groups, and good friends of the show and Allies Revolutionary Blackout Network, where our good friend Nick was one of the lead speakers. So joining us here, longtime guest, returning back now, Kshama Sawant. Thank you so much for joining us here at Hard Lens Media. We do appreciate the time that you have taken to join us here. And thank you again. So for our viewers, in case you don't know who she is, can you please introduce yourself to our viewers and subscribers? And I hope 2025 has been very productive for you.
Thank you so much. And likewise, I wish you all the best for this coming year. And my name is Kshama Sawant. As you said, I have been on your show before. I am a co-founder of Worker Strike Back, which is a nationwide organization for workers, union members, activists who want to fight against the rich, the ruling class, fight for something that will improve people's lives. So we are, among other things, we're calling for a $25 an hour minimum wage nationally, free healthcare for all, affordable housing funded by taxing the rich, union jobs for all. And Worker Strike Back is also calling for a new independent party for the working class, because neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are going to represent us, because they represent the interests of capitalism. But the whole idea of Worker Strike Back came from the 10 years that I was on the Seattle City Council. I was a socialist, the only socialist on the Seattle City Council. And in those 10 years, we won 4 elections. I left the City Council in 2023 undefeated, despite all the millions of dollars thrown against us by big business, including Jeff Bezos and Amazon themselves, despite all the opposition, vicious opposition, I might say, from the Democratic Party, which is the ruling party of Seattle. There's not really a Republican establishment that much to speak of. And one of those elections that we won was against an attempt to recall me after I had democratically won an election in 2019. There was an effort to recall me in 2021, which also we defeated. And throughout that time, we won historic victories. We made Seattle the first major city to win $15 an hour as the minimum wage. And in fact, one of the major battles we won as part of that historic effort, was to win inflation adjustments. So today, starting January 1st, all workers who are on minimum wage in Seattle receive $20.76, which is the highest minimum wage in the nation. This is what's possible through what I call a fighting strategy, meaning not having illusions in the Democrats in big business or in the NGO and liberal establishment, but building the independent strength of the working class with an understanding that none of these forces that represent big business are ever going to be on your side. So it is our task to engage in class struggle, meaning not speaking to them or sending emails to them or something like that, but really building movements on the street, bringing that voice into City Hall, and making sure that we force the establishment to concede because of the strength of the movement.
And the thing is, because you were bringing this up a lot during the DNC convention, overall, what is lacking on the platform for the Democrats. And, after seeing Biden fail miserably, especially during his first debate against Trump, and then Kamala Harris taking up the torch, throughout that time, they didn't have any real policy or plan. It took them 45 days to even have policies or either that campaign issues. And they didn't have it for 45 days. All the other presidential candidates had it for day one. Say whatever you will about them. I mean, they all had a plan, but even then, throughout the entire convention, we were seeing their utter hypocrisy. I mean, most notably, what was happening to the Palestinian voices there. And I want to pull up this tweet. This came out on the 15th, and ceasefire is debatable now, because I think we're seeing just how long a ceasefire can last, and it's probably never. I mean, ask the people of Lebanon about that. But This is something that you tweeted out. If Gaza ceasefire happens, credit goes to abandon Harris and millions of anti-war workers who said no to Harris. Dr. Jill Stein, Workers Strike Back. You know who doesn't get credit? Democrats, liberal, and left media labor leaders who tried to shame us into voting for Harris. And then, of course, you shout a lot of us in independent media. Savvy Sabs done fantastic work. Due Dissidents, Hard Lens Media, Jimmy Dore, Revolutionary Blackout Network, Chris Hedges, and so many others. But what I wanted to ask you about, especially now that we are seeing the waning days of the Biden-Harris administration, what comes next in regards to the war zone and the crisis of really addressing the fact that this war is still continuous? It's been happening since October 7th. It's expanded now into Lebanon, by proxy into Syria, and then, of course, there's the back and forth that's happening in Iran. What exactly can, I guess, organizers and people who are trying to bring attention to this do pushing forward? Because right now there's be a huge disengagement into politics after what all of us went through throughout 2024 with Trump and Kamala Harris. I think that's a big question mark, or people want to know, like, where do we go forward from here?
Yes, and by the way, the second tweet that you read out, obviously, I just wanted to make clear to your viewers, it was not an exhaustive list. For example, Brianna Joy Gray and our Bad Faith podcast are also part of it. I mean, it's a short list, but it's an important list of independent media, independent spokespeople who never agreed to shill for the Democratic Party, and especially in the face of a genocide. I think that needs to be recognized because, and I'm not doing that just for self-congratulation of a group of people, but the reason I sent out those tweets was because I wanted to help ordinary people, working people, recognize that part of building successful movements is understanding. So, part of the, I would say, fundamental, what are the fundamentals? What are the backbone of that make or break movements? Do you win historic victories or do you not? That partly depends on correctly recognizing, having the clarity about who's actually on your side and who's not. And sometimes it's very easy to recognize that, for example, Nancy Pelosi, she's not on our side. She's very openly on the side of
Very
the
clear,
capital.
very clear indeed.
Yeah, she's very clear. But that's not where the confusion lies. The confusion lies in other areas, and I want to come to that in a second. But as you said correctly, Kit, I mean, and that's why I said in the tweet, if a ceasefire happens. So you said correctly, it remains to be seen. And in fact, Chris Hedges, for example, sent out a long message on X, which everybody should read. I think it was yesterday or the day before. Very useful recap of the history of the region about how accord after accord, so-called accord after accord, agreement after agreement has been broken both by the Israeli state and by US imperialism and by Western imperialism and by the capitalist interest on the West, where it's very clear when you look at the whole sort of the chronology of the history, it's very clear that it's not in the interests of US capitalism, Western imperialism as a whole, or the Israeli state to allow an actual cessation of war and violence against the Palestinians. Why? Because all the while, throughout the decades of that region, what's the one real force that has posed any kind of challenge to the rapacious interest, the plundering by the billionaires, by multimillionaires of that oil-rich region. And by the way, it's not just Western billionaires, it's also the Saudi monarchs. The ruling class of the Middle East itself is complicit in this. That's why you cannot look at this from a nationalistic or regionalistic or ethnic lines. You have to look at this along class lines, because capitalism is a global system, and so the capitalist class will come in different, they'll look different. They'll look like Jeff Bezos or American billionaires, or they'll look like Saudi monarchs. So you have to understand that they are fundamentally all representing the same interest. But throughout the decades, what has been the force that has been the biggest challenge for these interests of the ruling class? It's the concept of pan-Arabism, to sort of the uniting of ordinary people across the Middle East against those who are plundering their region, against those who are wreaking havoc on their lives. And the best strategy that the US ruling class and Western imperialism, and by the way, this also goes back to the erstwhile British Empire, the best strategy they found was to promote this concept of Israel and imposing that against the ordinary people of the region who obviously are resisting this kind of plundering of their resources. And so, all of that logic explains why there's not automatically going to be a ceasefire now. And in terms of your question of what's needed, absolutely what is going to be needed is an international movement, and the movements in the US are going to be super crucial. Movements that are independent of the parties of the ruling class. See, if we have movements that have illusions in any of the parties of the ruling class, that's when, in terms of, what makes or breaks a movement, that is one of the fundamental points that breaks the movement. It's not possible for us to succeed without that. And with that clarity, then comes the question of, what are the tactics we should use for the overall independent strategy of the movements. For that, we will need massive strike actions in workplaces, shutting down of the economy, with the demand that we need a permanent end to the violence against the Palestinians. We need the Israeli state out of Gaza permanently, out of the Palestinian lands permanently. We need a permanent end to the military and political aid by the U.S. state, because without that, Israel could not carry out a war even for any short while. So that is going to be pivotal. But to force this kind of concession from the extremely powerful US capitalist class and their political spokespeople in the Democratic and Republican parties will need that kind of almighty movement, and that will involve, and that will need, it's not a choice, we will need massive strike action by the union movement, by non-unionized workers, shutting down the economy. We will need mass civil disobedience. We will need mass movements on the streets. Those are the kinds of, those are components of what I would call the fighting strategy that will be needed to actually put a stop to this kind of violence against the Palestinians.
And the thing is now, there's the long-term consequences that we're seeing, though, with the politicians, for example. You're seeing the Democrats desperately try and rebuild their image of them being a worker party after so many, I guess, throughout the entire year of 2024, dismissing the coalition that made them what they were. I mean, if I look back to 2016, which is now 8 years ago, I would say fair enough to say 8 years ago from now, you had something that really could have made real significant change in the political landscape. And since then, it's been abused by the Democrats. You have the Democrats now trying to find new leadership. And one of my concerns is that during this lull period time where people are disengaged from politics, unfortunately, there's going to be the rise up of the midterm election cycle. There's going to be some quasi Trump derangement syndrome, and people are going to try and be suckered into the Democratic Party. How do we really handle this on two fronts? Because on the one hand, you're going to have the establishment media and the vote blue no matter who sycophants saying, well, you got to support us Democrats because we're the only ones here. But at the same time, too, as soon as they are given power or even a supermajority, they put their hands in their pocket and say, well, we can't help you. Next time, vote harder. We got to break that narrative. And how do we break that narrative when it seems to be like everyone is, like a vast majority of the population is hypnotized into believing like, okay, we gave Republicans a chance, let's give Democrats a chance. And as soon as we give the Democrats a chance, nothing fundamentally changes, to quote Joe Biden.
Yes, I mean, first of all, you touched on a very important point there in terms of, concretely, we are going to be confronted with what will happen in the midterm elections. And the point there is that inevitably the Trump administration will end up carrying out policies that will expose their real nature to a lot of working people who might have illusions in Trump right now, who are understandably angry at the Democrats and who refuse to vote for Harris. I mean, that was absolutely correct that they refused to vote for Harris. But the problem is that Trump is no alternative either. And so you're going to continue to have a situation of people being pushed towards the Democrats or towards the Republicans, towards the Democrats or towards the Republicans, sort of being forced to oscillate between two parties that both, despite their differences, represent the interests of the capitalist class, as long as there is no alternative for the working class. That is why I believe it is crucial that Workers Strike Back and my socialist organization, Revolutionary Workers, we are both adamant about this point, that we need a new independent party for the working class, because as long as we don't have that political alternative for working people to turn towards, they're it's not that that they will have no choice. And like you use the word hypnotized. I mean, it's I wouldn't I wouldn't blame working people for turning towards one or the other when they have no other options.
Correct.
But at this point, I also don't think that it's so much that working people have some massive illusions really in the Democratic Party. In fact, right, the whole election result was a historic rebuke to Biden, to Harris, and the
Agreed.
Democratic Party for completely snubbing the working class on the cost of living crisis. Chuck Schumer going after the election, going on TV and saying, well, we just weren't effective in our message to the working class. We couldn't convince these stupid peasants that, oh, the economy is good. You just don't recognize economy is good. Even though you're not able to pay your rent, you are holding down 2 or 3 jobs just to put food on the table. You have massive medical debt, student debt, credit card debt. You just don't understand that the economy is good, working well. You just need to be pounded on the head and convinced that it is good. So my point is that working people are not stupid. They understand that the Democratic Party has completely betrayed them. But the question is then, what else? What else should we do? What is the strategy to break out of the Democrats and Republicans, both of whom are going to completely betray you? And let's not be under any illusions about the real nature of Trump. I mean, a lot of people say that, well, we should credit Trump for bringing up the question of ceasefire, even if it does not actually happen at the end. Look at what he was able to do that Biden didn't do. And let's also be clear that Biden is cynically taking credit. I mean, it's completely ridiculous that he is trying to take credit for this message of ceasefire, while he spent his entire time since October 7th opposing any aspect of ceasefire, continuing to funnel billions of dollars into the Israeli war against the Palestinians. But the real reason that this even happened to this degree, and where Trump felt the pressure, was because Trump is a little bit of an unpredictable character, and which is why the ruling class didn't have him as their first preference. They preferred Biden or Harris to Trump. Why? Because Trump is very much a representative of the billionaire class. Let's again have no illusions about whose side he's on, but he's also an unpredictable element that sometimes he will carry out actions that represent more so his own personal career interests in showing the Democratic Party down than representing the interests of US imperialism as a whole. That's different than Biden and Harris, for example, who, even at the risk of losing election, and we saw this YouGov poll that showed that actually her stance on the genocide actually might have been one of the main reasons that cost Harris the election, because the poll showed that out of the 19 million people who voted for Biden in 2020 but refused to vote at all last year, a third of them said the genocide was the main reason. So the point being that even at the risk, knowingly, at the risk of losing their own election, the Democrats were still dogged and unshakable representatives of the agenda of US capitalism, which part of which is continuing this genocide in Gaza. Whereas Trump is a little bit of an unpredictable element, where he'll do things because he sees the rebuke that was delivered to the Democratic Party, and he does not want to be victim of the same thing. And so even though he knows that the ceasefire will probably not continue, but he wants the brownie points of having said to Netanyahu that, you better do this. So that's what's happening here. So as long as you have one cynical party doing its own cynical things with its own cynical flavor, the Democrats, versus the Republican Party and Trump with their own right-wing populism, with their own career interests and so on, as long as you have people being yo-yoed between these two parties, there's not going to be any clarity, any option, and it will continue to stymie the movements of working people. It will continue to prevent working people from winning any significant victory. So it's not about electoralism versus movements. It's a question of what political position do movements of working people need to have in order to win victories? That is the correct question, rather than making a false dichotomy. And that is why the question of an independent party for the working class cannot be avoided. And here is where worker strike back comes in. All the independent media, the rare ones who have spoken up against the Democrats and Republicans, come in, because the vast majority of the labor leadership, unfortunately, is very much tied both to capitalism and to the representatives of capitalism. And so you saw Sean O'Brien, the president of UAW, the Auto Workers Union, go in the DNC and then shill for Kamala Harris. It is shameful, but that's what's happening in the labor movement leadership. You had Sean O'Brien, on the other hand, the leader of the Teamsters, making fueling illusions in Donald Trump. Neither is an option. But here you have the labor leadership doing this. The vast majority of them shilling for the Democrats, and then some speaking up in favor of Trump. Both are going to be dead ends. And so as long as you have that situation, it is going to be an obstacle. And that is why Worker Strike Back is calling for an independent party. And for that to happen, we cannot hold our breath and expect that the labor leadership, the current leadership, is going to do it. We need a rank and file uprising, a militant uprising among the rank and file of the union movement itself.
Mm-hmm. What I find fascinating, though, especially as we start talking about an independent party, this was the first time in a long time that third parties were given a lot of attention. But my criticism for third parties is that there was the ball that was dropped, and I maybe I have too much of a high standard for the Greens, and yes, by proxy, the Libertarians. But going forward, there has to be something to show success. And so was your organization that you're part of, would you guys be open up to other aspects as well, such as citizen ballot initiatives and getting other states to be citizen ballot initiative states? I mean, it's one thing to fight to have another third party, which I'm all in favor of, but what I think a lot of people who are burnt out by electoral politics in general is they need a victory. They need to see something to be achieved to take power away from these politicians in Washington, D.C. And the one thing that's been brought up on my show is ballot initiatives. Illinois is a ballot initiative state. California is one. You got a couple, there's like 21 other states that are ballot initiative states in which the citizens decide and circumvent and go around the politicians at the state level, and in turn make laws happening in their land. I mean, most famously, it can be making cannabis legal for recreational and medical use. And there's been talk about using citizen ballot initiatives for Medicare for all. I mean, these are things that people want to see, people are in support of. There's also been citizen ballot initiatives for protecting a woman's right to choose. And that in turn also happening in red states that are citizen ballot initiative states. So is that something that you would be part of, that you would want to help promote? And these are that by some extent, maybe helping make other states citizen ballot initiative states, because the people feel like they're not being represented. And this is probably the last tool that we have to really get us our voice back and stand up against these politicians who for a long time live in their ivory tower.
I think you brought up a very important question that is on the minds of the people who are thinking seriously about these things. And these are the correct questions they're thinking. I mean, as you said, they're burned out from politicians selling them out. And so their conclusion from that is, well, we need something else. So, I think that brings up a very important aspect of what kind of party I'm talking about and what kind of effort we led. Those of us who launched Worker Strike Back, many of us are socialists, we're Marxists. And that's not an incidental thing. Why we were able to carry out the kind of work, which unfortunately is the sole example in our lifetimes. What we did in Seattle for 10 years is the sole example. In history, we have other examples, but in our lifetimes, this is like in the current times, I mean, this is the sole example. And why we were different from others who even may run independent or who may be on the left in the Democratic Party. What was different here is that, first of all, we were never an organization that is mainly electoral, meaning we didn't see our task as just trying to run elections and then getting a seat and then holding on to it and then making all kinds of compromises and sellouts just in order to retain the seat. No, we've always been socialists like myself and socialists who worked alongside me and who are now part of Worker Strike Back. We were always an organization that was first and foremost rooted in mass movements. And then as part of that movement, we, it is a strategy question. Does it make sense to run for office to represent the interests of the movement. So that's how it came about. I was never, I was never, I never became an activist or got into politics in order to run for office. In fact, I was extremely reluctant to be the person who was going to be the candidate. And in fact, you need that kind of reluctance, because that's often a sign that that person maybe has the backbone to not sell out working people. But the point is that we were never electoral to begin with. Our starting point was activism in the Occupy movement. And it was in the Occupy movement that it was clear, for some of us anyway, that there was a historic opening for working class politics to carry forward the movement of Occupy. I mean, Occupy was historic, but it also had lots of deficiencies. And we wanted to, when we ran for office, we wanted to use the momentum that was clearly available, because working people were angry about the Great Recession. Remember, that was what
Mhm.
the Occupy movement came in the wake of the Great Recession. But not only that, but the anger specifically at Obama for bailing out the big banks and the Wall Street billionaires who caused the crisis in the first place, and selling out working people. That's where the anger was came from. So there was some clarity starting to emerge at that time that Obama is not really on our side, and the Democrats are selling us out. So at that moment in 2012, we ran against the House Speaker here for the State House in Washington State, because we saw an opening for working class politics. And we didn't win that election, but we got 30% of the vote in the general election, which was enormous for a very tiny organization like ours. And with that momentum, then we ran against the most long-standing Democrat at that time in City Hall, and we were able to win in 2013, our first election. But when we won that election, we did not. A lot of people told me personally, because I was the one who got elected, that, oh, now you need to hunker down and listen to the Democrats. Don't do your whole activisty antics. Now you are a policymaker. Now you're not an activist. We completely refused that kind of playbook. We understood that when the only way you can use elected office for working people is to understand that it's not about you sitting there and talking to your quote unquote colleagues, because the Democrats who represent capitalism are not your colleagues. They are on the opposite side of the class line. They are your political enemy, and that your friends are working people. And the power of this elected position, if you want to use it, comes from using that from employing that position to build movements of working people. So one of the first things I did was help launch the 15 Now campaign, which was a grassroots movement to win $15 an hour. And it was through that kind of effort that we were able to win. In other words, using elected office to build mass movements, which is the only thing that is a threat to the Democrats. It's not about you as an individual. You as an individual are never going to be a threat. I mean, can you imagine me as alone with all the Democrats? I would easily have been marginalized had I and other socialists alongside me not understood that the only power of this elected position is if we use it to build movements. And so you're right, Kit. I mean, just having somebody elected on a working class message is absolutely no guarantee. I mean, and it's not even just about a third party. You can have a third party and still have elected people who are doing nothing. I mean, and that's a critique I have of the Green Party. I mean, we Workers Strike Back strongly supported the Jill Stein campaign. We literally had many of our people go to Dearborn, Michigan to campaign for her, including myself. We set aside our lives to do that, because that winning the highest possible vote for Jill Stein as the anti-war most prominent anti-war candidate was in the interest of the anti-war movement and working people. So we did that. But I have my own critiques of the Green Party. I mean, for example, they have several elected positions. They say that they have over 100. I'm not sure, but my point is that they have multiple elected positions. But what are they doing with those elected positions? We had one elected position, and we made history repeatedly, and we did not lose a single election. I mean, we'll still in the future there will be lost elections as well. We're not going to win every battle. That's not the point. The point is that we never wavered from our fighting approach. We at every moment used our elected position to fight for working people. So I wanted to explain that is that is what is needed. But when you have that, the elected position can be a powerful weapon in the sight of the working class, in our arsenal. And I'm using these words not deliberately, because it is a political battle, because the capitalist class is at war against working people, and we need to fight back. We're not going to change society by trying to have some negotiations with them. They are not here to negotiate. They fight against us, and we have to fight back. But I do want to also address the question of ballot initiatives. Absolutely. In fact, this past year showed that working people are actually more progressive than CNN and the Democratic Party would like to admit, because you saw all kinds of pro-abortion, pro $15 minimum wage, pro-union ballot initiatives succeed in many of the same states that actually ended up electing Trump. So it really shows that there's a massive opening, and I think that running a statewide ballot initiative around Medicare for all is actually would be a really good idea. Building, if we can build a mass basis for that, it would be incredibly important. But we have to be clear, ballot initiatives by themselves are not a panacea. And I know, Kid, you keep saying citizens ballot initiatives, and yes, it is ballot initiatives are electoral measures where voters directly get to vote. Yes, that's true, and that's a good thing. But by itself, that is absolutely no guarantee that the ballot initiative will win. In fact, if there is any ballot initiative that is for example, Medicare for all, if we decide, let's say, in Washington state, to do a ballot initiative around Medicare for all, you know what will happen? The entire might of the insurance industry, of big pharma, of Wall Street will be channeled into defeating that ballot initiative. The Democratic Party will be brought to bear, because they are spokespeople of these business interests. They will come down like a ton of bricks against the ballot initiative. And so my point is that whether you have an elected position where an individual is elected, or you have a social movement where there are no specific elections, but there is a movement leadership, because every movement will have a leadership, it depends on whether it's accountable or not. Or you have ballot measures, like for around Medicare for all, for example, or if in some states we do $15 an hour ballot measures, then regardless of which scenario you're looking at, it does not absolve us of the need to have a fighting strategy. There is no easy avenue. There is no shortcut. There is no shortcut, let alone an easy shortcut under capitalism to win victories for working people. Anything and everything is going to be a huge fight back. I'll give you a concrete example from right now. Right now, I hope your viewers know that one of the big historic victories we won in Seattle was an Amazon tax, meaning a tax
I remember
on,
this.
yeah, the wealthiest corporations to fund affordable housing. You know how big this tax is? Last year, that tax raised $450 million in revenue. That is enormous. I mean, compared to the fact that you have tax cuts on the rich every which way. And so that's a huge tax that we won through the city council. It was not a ballot measure. We won it through the city council. We forced the city council to take a vote on our tax Amazon um, um, demand. But we did that by having a real threat of a ballot measure, by collecting 30,000 signatures around a ballot measure. So it was very clear to big business and the Democratic Party that if they didn't pass the Amazon tax from the city council, we would go to the ballot, and we had a real shot at winning it. So my point is that it's not about this or that mechanism, and there is no silver bullet mechanism that allows us to do something without having to confront the full might of the capitalist class and their political spokespeople. There is no such universe. Anything will be a fight, and we have to use the best possible tactics at those moments in order to win anything. So if we do a ballot initiative around anything meaningful, expect that it will be opposed by the ruling class, by the Democratic Party. And so this year in February, on February 11th, there is going to be a ballot initiative that will be voted on by Seattle voters. And that ballot initiative raises a small amount of money, still important, but small amount of money, $52 million, for affordable housing, in on top of the Amazon tax that we already won. What have the Democrats done? They have put, so that was called Prop 1. Now on the ballot, when people get their ballot, it will be called Prop 1A, because Prop 1B has been put forward by the Democrats on the city council, which does not raise the revenues. It just moves money around to robbing Peter to pay Paul, because they don't want to tax big business if they can help it. So that's the real insidious role that the Democrats will play. Even if it's a ballot initiative, they will mess with it in order to undermine it.
Mm-hmm. And I think as a final note that I want to bring up here, and that is, while we are going to be witnessing a shift between power, one of the big concerns, or I could see it happening, and that is the infamous parades. And I call them parades. I want to give a shout out to Nick Thompson. And what I mean by parades are the protests in front of Trump Tower, or anything that Trump says is going to immediately cause a protest. And there's that narrative of, okay, we're going to do this fake resistance against Trump. All the while, the Democrats will capitalize on it. So how do we stand up against the, I guess, infiltration, which is something I noticed during the first 4 years of the Trump administration? And that is, you had a lot of Democrats and liberals infiltrate a lot of progressive and independent groups that were covering anti-war and doing so much more. But as soon as Biden got in, a lot of people disappeared. They got silenced. They got suppressed. And it's one thing to be vigilant about. And it's something that we are going to have to talk about, because all what's going to be brought up during these parades is that, okay, we have to resist against Trump, so vote Democrat. The infiltration, I mean, that's a thing we have to be very clear of, and that is a narrative being presented here, and that is, you have to support Democrats because, heaven forbid, but we realize that anytime there is trust put in the Democrats, we always get screwed over. So the infiltration question, I mean, that's something that we got to keep, I like to say on my show, our heads on a swivel all about.
Absolutely. And in fact, that infiltration happens in so many nefarious ways, right? It's not only when it is they say vote Democrats for in the next midterm election. It also happens in the way that the Democratic Party attempts to co-opt movements, and that happens all the time. They attempt to co-opt movements because if they can help it, they will want to crush it entirely. But if they can't crush it, they want to control the narrative. They want to own the narrative and falsify the narrative by saying that, well, the Democratic Party gave you this by having excellent stakeholder discussions with big business and everyone at the table. They love to do this. Democrats love to do this. So, for example, when we won the Amazon tax, like I said, we won it by forcing the Democrats, including progressive Democrats on the city council, to concede, because in the back rooms, they were viciously opposing it. I mean, I literally had these progressive Democratic city council members calling me on the phone, and this was during COVID. It was 2020. That's why they were calling me, because we weren't in City Hall. We were remotely working, and angrily shouting at me for having the temerity to bring forward the tax Amazon demand. Then they tried to use BLM against us with, and this is where, when you say infiltration, it is not only the Democratic Party officials, it's also the liberal organization leaders who are either on the periphery of the Democratic Party or are openly supporting the Democratic Party. So many of these BLM leaders, I call them misleaders, because that is what they did. They misled the movement, and they played a really insidious role where they would be on the streets calling for abolition of the police and all these radical demands, saying they're anti-capitalist, whatever. And then in the back rooms, what they were doing was making agreements with the Democratic Party in order to try and crush the tax Amazon movement. So when we brought forward the Amazon tax, the George Floyd rebellion hadn't begun yet. But when the George Floyd rebellion began, our tax Amazon movement got a massive boost, because there was so much support for the idea of taxing Jeff Bezos and other billionaires to fund affordable housing. Because guess which is the community that is the most disproportionately affected by the lack of affordable housing and by skyrocketing rents in Seattle? It is the Black, working class, and poor people. And so when we went to the protests with our tax Amazon petition, people were like, hell yes, I want to sign this. I want to tax Amazon. But what did the BLM misleaders do? They went around saying, and alongside the Democrats, they went around saying tax Amazon is not a black issue. It's not a black demand. And these people, because I'm not black, that I'm co-opting the Black Lives Matter movement. We did not accept that kind of gatekeeping. So rule number one is you represent you. If you're running a movement, if you want to be true to the working class, then you cannot accept this kind of gatekeeping, whether it's the Democrats or liberal leaders or NGO leaders or any of them. And so that kind of clarity will go a long way in preventing, as you said, that kind of infiltration. So, in other words, we have to have overall clarity that anybody who is representing the interests, ultimately, whether they admit it or not, representing the interests of the wealthy, of the capitalists, they are not on our side. So, in that sense, we have to have clarity that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans represent us, but that clarity needs to extend also to which leaders are on our side. So if your labor union leader comes and tells you that you should not be fighting for the Amazon tax because that's not a demand that we have agreed on, then you should disagree with them. Just because they are the leader of a labor union doesn't make them right. Your job as a rank and file union member then is to oppose them. And so that's the kind of clarity we need, because there is lots of anger in society, but that anger is dispersed, it's dissipated, it's not a channel, it's not organized. The anger at the billionaires needs to be channeled and organized. As Malcolm X said, we working people, ordinary people, we aren't outnumbered, we are out organized. And that's why I keep giving the examples of how we won 15 and Amazon tax, because they are some of the only examples in our current times which show how we get organized and bring the power of tens of thousands of people to bear, to force the establishment, to force the ruling class to do what we do. And then ultimately, I also, it would be remiss if I don't add this, which is that ultimately, if we want to actually make changes in society, we have to talk about democratic public ownership of corporations. I mean, look at the LA wildfires. Look at what's happening with climate catastrophe. I mean, we are on a very short clock to save the planet. And it is not going to happen on the basis of capitalism, because as long as the fossil fuel barons, as long as the Wall Street banks, as long as the billionaires own all these resources, we are not going to have any say in what happens. So it's not like about you yourself recycling and composting. It's about what happens on a mass scale. Because if you look at the causes of carbon emissions, they are on in the industrial scale, the industrial power sector, the transportation sector, the meat and dairy industry, all of this, none of which we have in our control. So in other words, we can't control, we working people, we cannot control what we don't own. So we have to confront the question of democratic public ownership. That is also relevant to free healthcare. There is no way we are going to have free healthcare as long as a few people at the top control all the industries that are in relation to healthcare. Or really, it's not delivering healthcare, it's preventing healthcare. And so there also, it brings up the question of publicly owning, in the hands of working people, the pharmaceutical industry and all of healthcare.
One other thing here I want to bring up, and that is my friend Roger Meadows. He wanted to reach out to you about this, and thank you, Roger Meadows, for your support. This is a little bit of a long statement, but I'll read it. Kshama, I know you're big on unions, but it's important to know that we cannot fight 21st century villains with 20th century weapons. The reason why unions worked so well 100 years ago was because we were only country standing after World War II, so there was no country to outsource to. However, today is a new day, and unions are not going to be able to stop your job from being outsourced out of the country. Let's not forget, Musk and Bezos are taking NLRB to the Supreme Court of the United States to get it deemed unconstitutional, which through proxy would make unions unconstitutional. The only way we're going to win this is if we transition from a shareholder corporate-owned company to 75% of the economy being collectively stakeholder, cooperatively owned of that 75%. 75% should be worker-owned via worker co-ops. And I'm not talking about consumer cooperative like that. supermarket, that you were talking about that failed was not a worker cooperative, that was consumer cooperative. However, you feel about worker co-ops, understand that when the workers own it, you guarantee American-made manufacturing workplace, not safety, not only putting community and natural environment at risk. That is the future. That is what we need to embrace when the workers own it. The need for striking is no more is no more because the workers are not going to strike against themselves. Also, I completely understand what you're talking about with citizen ballot initiatives. I was never under any illusion. For some reason, people think that when I speak about it, I don't think that there's going to be big money up against it, which is why I have citizen ballot initiative idea amendment for a public financing of a ballot measure. So that was from Roger Meadows. He's a good friend of the show, talks a lot about worker co-ops. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on this before we end the interview. But I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a very important question, actually. And all the questions you've asked, actually, Kid, I really appreciate, because they are questions very likely on the minds of many people, and we don't get a chance to talk to everybody individually. So these are questions that are important to discuss in building movements. And so, yeah, I mean, of course, co-ops and worker-owned co-ops, as Roger is talking about, are valuable. We need that. But the question is one of scale, meaning if you have a small co-op here or there, that does not change the status quo under capitalism. A few people would be helped, and that's always valuable. But the value of this idea of worker ownership is when it is on a mass scale, like I was saying about democratic public ownership. In other words, not government programs in the sense that the capitalist government owns it, but actually a fundamental shift away from capitalism, which is why I'm a socialist, which means that workers running the work of the economy democratically, not that there would be billionaires, basically making fighting for a society that where billionaires don't exist. That's what I'm talking about. So in other words, it's like having the idea of worker ownership in a co-op, but on a scale that actually is transformative for society. But therein lies the crux, because how will we get from one or two worker co-ops to the kind of scale that we need, where we don't have rapacious big corporations, we don't have billionaires, but instead resources are owned democratically. Under capitalism, individual co-ops are at a big disadvantage. First of all, because they are denied the capital needed to compete with big for-profit corporations. So you see, it's a short timeline for many of them. Some of them end up, not out of bad intentions, but because there's no other way out, selling to big corporations, and there you go, it's gone. Then once it's sold to a big corporation under capitalism, the co-op is gone. So the point is that those are small efforts. If we wanted to make them big efforts, do we believe that the capitalist class, Jeff Bezos, everyone else, they would just allow us to do it, and they would just say, oh, this is great, if you can do it, great, you can keep expanding? No, that is why I was saying earlier that there is no avenue under capitalism where you can avoid class war with the capitalist class, because they will come and go to war against you. So in other words, they will not want any significant or substantial examples of worker-owned co-ops, because they send a different message to the working class that they don't want the working class to have. The message being that we don't need these billionaire-owned corporations, we can run our own economy. There is no way that the capitalist class is going to allow that message to survive. That is why you see co-ops not becoming the norm, but the exception. The norm under capitalism are enormous profit-making corporations. But what's problematic about them is not their size. It's the fact that a few people are making profits at the expense of both working people who are buying those products at inflated prices and the vast majority of the working class, the billions of people in this economy who have no say in it and who are barely getting by, while the richest 1% gets more wealth than the bottom 95%. So in other words, as long as the major wealth and resources are controlled by the capitalists, they will keep squeezing out any co-op. So it doesn't matter how good an example that is what will happen. And so, as I was saying, many co-ops established decades ago have either been driven out, they don't exist anymore, or they were turned into a for-profit model. So that's why the question of class struggle comes in, and that's why the question of unions comes in. It is not that unions succeeded in the past because they were more effective in the past and they are not effective now. No, the reason the union movement has so many historical examples of success is because of the strategy they used. And that
Mhm.
strategy needs to be brought back. And that strategy does include militant strike actions. It does include general strike actions. For example, the New Deal that many people know about, where there was a dramatic shift towards the improving living standards of the mass of American working people, that was not the beneficence of FDR, some progressive democratic politician. He was forced, Roosevelt, FDR was forced to carry out the New Deal because there were a number of general strikes that happened, including the pivotal 1934 Minneapolis general strike that was led by the socialists and communists in the Teamster Union. Those general strikes put such a scare in the capitalists that Roosevelt had to convince the capitalist class to accept the New Deal, because he correctly recognized that if they didn't, they would have a genuine revolutionary movement on their hands, and they did not want that. So the concessions they made as which came in as part of the New Deal, they were they were a concession, meaning they accepted them because they didn't want what was the worst option, which was a revolutionary movement. So there is no it is not about it's not that unions are a historical relic. What has happened is that since then the ideas of class struggle unionism have been decimated, and what you have is, the for the most part, is a labor leadership that is carrying out what I would call business unionism, meaning more or less trying to be at peace with the bosses, trying to be at peace with capitalism, and allowing some crumbs to filter down to working people, to ordinary union members, and so on. And that's what we need to destroy. We don't Destroying unions or the idea of unions is not going to help us, because the only way that workers can make any change in under capitalism is by getting organized, and union is simply an organized effort by working people in a workplace. That's what a union is. And so if you agree that workers cannot do anything individually and we need to get organized, then why would you be against the idea of unions? Unions are absolutely critical. They're part of the backbone of making any change. But unions by themselves are not a guarantee. If you have a union movement that is dominated by business unionist, pro boss, pro ruling class party ideas like we have today, then that is not going to be a recipe for success. Yes, that is true. But don't be against unions, be against business unionism. What we need is class struggle unionism, meaning a union movement that is fueled by a rank and file democracy and by militant ideas which carry out strike actions, which carry out general strikes, which carry out efforts that allow workers to win against the bosses, with a complete clarity that the bosses are never going to be on our side. And ultimately, I'll tell you, the reason the union movement had successes in the past, and this is not just in the US, it's throughout the world, is every period when the union movement had successes was a period when the rank and file was propelled forward by genuine socialist and communist ideas. In other words, an understanding that capitalism itself does not work for us, that we have to end the rule of the wealthy, of the billionaire class, understanding that billionaires should not exist, and understanding that we have to destroy the capitalist system. Otherwise, this system will destroy human civilization. It's either us, meaning the billions and the planet, or the billionaires. It's not going to be both. And so, having that clarity and gives you the ability to go into confrontation with the ruling class, that's what we need in the union movement.
And think is going forward, we do need to have more solidarity. We do need to start building coalitions. So, I'm more on the side of the citizen ballot initiatives. I think that this is a way in which we could push forward. Is there a possibility for unions? Yes, you have to deal with corruption, of course, but we're looking at all aspects. Perhaps there could be a larger coalition, and that's what I'm ever hopeful for. So, as a final note, are there any events or rallies or you know things taking place for your organization that my viewers and subscribers can know more about so they can help you? Is there anything down the horizon? Because right now is the time for a lot of groups to start building up their movement, their organizations, their structure, so that way we could be ready for what lies in store for us for the nightmare that is the 2026 midterms.
Yes, absolutely. This is very important. I mean, first of all, this is starting by the point that you introduced, Kit, which is the question of solidarity and coalitions. Again, really important point that we need working class solidarity. I will say again, one of, as I was saying, what are some of the fundamental backbone ideas that make or break movements? So one of the questions of that kind is solidarity with whom, coalitions with whom. So in other words, you don't try to build solidarity with those who represent a class that is antagonistic to you. In other words, the reason we don't try to build solidarity with the Democratic Party is because the Democratic Party represents the interests of the capitalist class, which is entirely opposed to the interests of workers. But that doesn't mean that we don't build solidarity with individuals who might have illusions of the Democratic Party, but who want to fight alongside us. So there's a difference. We don't, so as far as the politicians in City Hall were concerned, I didn't try to, I didn't try to tailor what I was willing to fight for to suit what suits them, because that's a recipe for selling out. Every day and each day and every day, that will be a recipe for selling out. So that's not what I did. What I did was build movements of ordinary people, many of whom who vote Democrat. So we have a difference with them about that, and we are very open. We believe in open and honest movements where we have debates in a respectful way. We talk about what we disagree with, but if they were willing to fight for $15 an hour, they were part of our movement. And that building a coalition, as you said, or solidarity with thousands, tens upon thousands, tens of thousands of ordinary people, that is what allowed us to win $15 an hour and Amazon tax, because it forced the powerful Democrats to concede. So it's important to understand solidarity and coalition with whom. And on that basis, we are absolutely, Worker Strike Back is absolutely organizing a very important event that is coming up on February 22nd and 23rd. That's a Saturday and Sunday in Seattle. So if you're in Seattle, you have no excuse not to show up. You absolutely have to do. If you live anywhere around Seattle, it's a short drive away. Please come on the 22nd and 23rd of February. If you live elsewhere, and if you're able to drive out here or fly out here, please do. I know funds are low for working people, but we need working people at this conference. So this is going to be an organizing conference to discuss how we fight the rich. It's an organizing conference to understand how we fight the rich. So all the things that Kit, you and I have been talking about this morning, that's what we're going to talk about in more detail. We're going to have Chris Hedges there. We're going to have Jill Stein there. And if you are not able to come in person, you can watch the live stream. But if you are able to come, please come in person. But otherwise, at least watch on live stream. Like I said, I will be speaking there, Chris Hedges and Jill Stein. There will be union rank and file members. We will have Cause, the organization, workers organization that is fighting for a union at the Amazon facility, Amazon Fulfillment Center in Garner, North Carolina. They are going to be here with us. So it's important. It's going to be a very important historic conversation. And I say historic not because it's going to be huge. I don't expect it to be huge, but I expect it to be very important and historic, because such a conversation has not happened in I don't know how long inside the labor movement and inside the working class in the United States, probably for decades. And that's the kind of importance there is, because we need to understand how to organize to fight the rich. We need to build the kind of coalitions that you're talking about. And we need people to join Worker Strike Back. So on February 23rd, is going to be the Worker Strike Back first in-person national convention. So please go to Workers Strike Back, all one word, workersstrikeback.org to register for both events. And please join Worker Strike Back. Kit, you yourself, if you haven't joined Worker Strike Back, please do so. We need people to become part of Worker Strike Back. It doesn't matter whether you're in a union or not. You just have to look at what we stand for, which is all the demands: the $25 an hour minimum wage, free healthcare for all, affordable housing, union jobs for all, and the need for an independent working class party, because the Democrats and Republicans don't represent us. If you agree with those basic tenets, then please join Worker Strike Back and come to the organizing conference, even if you're not joining Worker Strike Back, because the organizing conference is open for everyone.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us here, Kshama Sawant. As always, we appreciate having your voice in here. Thank you for your shout out as well. And now more than ever, folks, let's keep our heads on a swivel here for 2025 because we're already 17 days in, folks, and the madness seems to be going up and down. So as always, Kshama Sawant, thank you so much for your time. My viewers, the show isn't over yet. We still continue on. So please stay tuned. And once again, Kshama, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, kid.
SWAT team took your neighbor today. Watched them as they walked him away. You told yourself extremists come in all different shapes. Met his eyes and lowered your gaze. Is it too late for us to ever change? We are collecting the dust of better days. They're always watching us, but we're never safe. We're not meant to be safe, not meant to escape. We aren't meant to wake. Sheriff stopped your daughter today. Pepper sprayed her twice in the face. He must have had good reason if he'd treat her that way. At least that's what they've taught you to say. But is it too late for us to ever change? Once we're collecting the dust of better days, they're always watching us, but we're never safe. We're not meant to feel safe, not meant to escape. We aren't meant to wake. Feds arrived and had you detained. Said you'd made some posts they want changed. Tased you till you felt like you'd forgotten your name, or life before they had you contained. Oh, life before they had you contained. SWAT team took your neighbor today.